those theologically or maybe even philosophically, because the writer Solomon is not really giving us practical instruction, but he's giving us some interesting observation that is extremely disheartening, to be honest. But I believe the ultimate purpose is to remind us of the hope and the comfort that we have in the gospel of Jesus Christ, which I hope to work my way toward at the end of the sermon. But with that in mind, he says in verse 23, "All this have I proved by wisdom." And whether this is a reference to just chapter 7, because chapter 7 has become a little more practical, whether this is a reference to the entire book, writers differ on they have differing opinions. Regardless of what it is, he is essentially saying that he has come to all of these conclusions with wisdom. He's thought through them, prayed about them, sought God's wisdom, and this is conclusion. And he says, I have proved all this by wisdom. And in doing so, he determines in verse 23, I said, I will be wise. Now, this is an interesting idea that's presented because when we have an interest in something, getting more of that something, and I say this in a positive way, does not always satiate us. We always want more. It's obviously true in a sinful sense, which is what we call lust. But it's almost like Solomon had a glimpse of something glorious, and Solomon says, I crave more of it. I want more of that. I will be wise. I will cultivate that wisdom even more. And we see this in a small sense. You know, I hunt, for example, primarily because we do eat the meat. We eat a lot of venison. And when I first started, it's like, well, I'm just going to do this because it's practical. But if I'm not careful, it's a slippery slope where I want to spend thousands of dollars on the smallest stupid little thing that I probably really don't need, because there's a desire to engage, to cultivate that thing more. And so Solomon seems to say, I've proved this by wisdom, but I have determined I want even more wisdom. But his conclusion is interesting, but it was far from me. Now that's interesting. Solomon is one of the wisest man outside of God incarnate. But Solomon says, I've proved it by wisdom, and I want to be wise, and yet it seems like it's outside of my grasp, it's outside of my reach. And he says in verse 24, that which is far off and exceeding deep, who can find it out? Now, you'll forgive me, this is going to be a little more abstract and not very practical, but if I could just chase a rabbit. It is my very, very, very limited understanding that in some ways we have come to the edge of our observable universe in a few different ways. We've come to the conclusion that there is some math and numbers out there that is just way too much for us to even begin to comprehend. I mean, we've come from figuring out that 2 + 2 is 4 all the way to ideas of numbers that just I can't even begin to wrap my mind around. Mathematically, there's a discussion that I was told about by my brother, who's a smart one in the family, that mathematicians now, they say that math is, what is it they said? That math is the language of the universe, because with proper math, you can predict the things that happen in the universe. So in regards to math, it's almost like we've come to the edge of how much we can, and I say that carefully because there's always another advancement, but what I'm trying to say is that we begin to recognize how small we really are. Regarding suffering, and I realize I've addressed that topic a lot in the last several months, but regarding suffering, just really quick, for all of the brilliant minds that are out there, suffering is always the last major thing that people can never really tackle, because if they figure out suffering in a philosophical, abstract sense, when they suffer, they forget everything they've ever learned. And so we've come to the end in our pursuit of knowledge because of suffering. Because when we're miserable, what difference does it make if suffering means I'll be reincarnated into an eagle one day? Which is a very huge oversimplification, but you see the point. I don't keep up with it at all, but it does kind of interest me. But I've heard what we call quantum physics is threatening to overthrow everything we thought we knew. I guess microscopically speaking, the universe goes so small and the laws of physics as we know them don't behave the same in that miniature, minuscule, microscopic world. Don't ask me to explain that. I don't really understand it. But what I'm saying is that what Solomon says to me is so apt. That which is far off and exceeding deep, who can find it out? Again, it's not very practical, and I understand that, but there's something glorious here, because in a way, that's God's answer to Job. And that's why God points to nature, and that Job cannot rule or overcome nature. And the reminder, God is basically saying, you're too small, but I'm big enough. It's almost like the conclusion, and I don't say this dogmatically because it's hard to know, but I feel like Solomon has come to this place in his life. He says, you know what? For everything I've ever figured out, the more I learn, I know nothing. And it is a reminder that a sense of purpose, of identity, the very meaning of life, it's found only in God and not in things of this world. It's just not there. Solomon says, who can find it out? Now, verse 25, I don't know, if I'm being brutally honest, if this is a topic change. Because on one hand, it seems like it is. On the other hand, it seems like he's building off of what he said about wisdom. And this is interesting, all right? He goes on to say, I applied my heart to know and to search, to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, which arguably is a good definition of philosophy, and to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. He told us this in chapter 2. It's almost like Solomon is saying, you know what, I want to know everything. I don't, not just as a pious, uppity Christian, but I search the depths of wickedness and folly. And Solomon says this. Here's one conclusion he's come to. He's discovered something worse than death. And he says in verse 26, I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets and her hands as bands. This seems to be a further reference to the evil woman or the adulterous woman that he speaks so much about in Proverbs, in the book of Proverbs. And he says that the adulterous woman, the flirting woman, the woman who is deceiving men, Solomon says is worse than death. The idea, and I touched on this in Proverbs several years ago, it's obviously not calling out women at all, of course, but it's the idea of lust. Now, I find this so provoking in this passage because Solomon, we know this morally speaking from Scripture. And I don't think any of us here would argue with that. But don't forget, Solomon sought this out firsthand. He had 700 wives, 300 concubines, something like that. I might have got the numbers backwards. Had all those mother-in-laws. I feel bad for him. I'm just kidding. Don't laugh at mother-in-law jokes, Jesse. just trying to watch out for you. Solomon, he knew the dangers of what it was like to be ruled by your lusts. What I find even more thought-provoking is that there is this physical, sensual aspect of it that the Bible does warn against. But remember that the book of 1 Kings or the 2 Kings also tells us that part of the reason Solomon married all those women was because of it was political, to have an affiliation, to have peaceful political relationship with other countries. So seemingly his lust, not just in a sensual sense, but in his lust for power, which I'm sure he didn't mind lining up with his physical lusts. Solomon says this is so much worse than death. And it almost seems to me that Solomon, now notice the second phrase, whoso pleaseth God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be taken by her. Solomon almost acknowledges that when a person is so given over to their lust, that's almost like God saying, all right, you want it that bad? I'm done then. which lines up a lot with Romans 1, where Paul says that they have gone, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, it's much more complex and deep than this, but Paul says that they have changed the natural use of women, of one another in all actuality. And they've perverted these things, which is an alluding to homosexuality. But Paul concludes that section of Romans 1 by saying that by reminding us God gave them over to that. They were trying to run away from God so much that it's a dog pulling on a leash, and God says, all right, you want to go there. He lets go of the leash, and he lets him go. And so Solomon says the one that pleases God, they're not going to fall into that trap. They're not going to fall into that snare. But the sinner shall be taken by her. Now, maybe I should be more literal with the verse. But there's something so provoking, something so gut-wrenching, where it's almost like Solomon is essentially saying, I've proved all this by wisdom, and here's what I've discovered. If you don't desire God enough, or that's not quite the right way to phrase it, if you keep trying to run from God, He will eventually let you have what you actually want. And that conclusion is worse than death. The wisest man in the world makes that observation. Notice he kind of goes deeper a little bit in verse 27, says, Behold, this have I found, saith the preacher, counting one by one to find out the account. It's a reckoning. He's looking at everything. Which yet my soul seeketh. I'm still looking. I've looked one by one, counting one by one. I'm still looking. But I find not. One man among 1,000 have I found. That is, one good man in 1,000 men I found. They're rare, few and far between, but I've found. But a woman among all those have I not found. Now, to be clear, those in a more modern mindset would say, well, see, the Bible's being chauvinistic. It's being sexist. I do appreciate what a few different old writers pointed out. Solomon is speaking from misery. All right, so it is inspired by the Holy Spirit, but God uses our personality. So Solomon is saying, of all the women I've known and been with, there's not one good woman. Which is a powerful and a painful reminder that Solomon was not looking in the right places. Solomon was looking for women in all the wrong places for all the wrong reasons to satisfy desires that he should have been fighting against. But Solomon has not found one good woman. But you couple that idea with what his mom said, and I do believe Proverbs 31 was written by Bathsheba, where the observation is made that a virtuous woman's price is not the same as rubies, but far, far, far above rubies. Let me just say this, dear woman, for you to be a good, godly woman, the Bible praises that when it never says that about men. The Bible never said that the price of a good man is far above rubies. I'd be fine with like quartz, to be honest, but doesn't say that. The calling placed upon a woman to be a good woman is an extremely high calling, and a good woman is very hard to find. And her price, a virtuous woman, is far above rubies. Again, Solomon says, I have not found one, which for all the women he'd been with in every sense of the idea, it's a sad thing for a man to say. He brings us all to a conclusion and says, Lo, now I believe is more conclusive of the entire thing, not just the seeking out women, but he says, Lo, this only have I found, that God hath made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions. I love this verse because it's kind of an argument I've used for a while in preaching, I guess. I live under a rock, so I don't really argue with that many people. But, people especially in the more modern day and age, people say, well, if God was so good, why did he create a world with so much suffering? And that's a very, very fair question. And it's a question I think that we could all ask, but we have to start with the right suppositions. God didn't create a world of suffering. God created a world and then we brought the suffering. So we can't pin the blame on God for the suffering. Solomon says, God hath made man upright. God made man right. God made man beautiful or glorious, or in other words, creation is just a wonderful thing. But they, speaking of humanity, have sought out many inventions, which to me speaks to the second point I've heard a lot of people bring up. Well, it's Adam's fault that we're in sin, and it is, sure. But the thing is, we kind of do what Adam did every day. We can't really pin the blame on Adam when we also willfully choose to sin. The many inventions speaks to their imagination. It speaks to executing those things in their imagination. And it's almost like what Solomon is saying. It doesn't matter who you are. God keeps doing things right, and we keep messing things up, which is a byproduct of sin, of course. But what Solomon is, I like this because in kind of this nihilistic, pessimistic, negative conclusion that there are no good women and there's a very few good men and women are worse than death, Solomon says that's not God's fault. For all of the wickedness of the world, for how broken the world is, that's not God's fault. That's our fault. And God keeps doing things right. But think about it, dear Christian. I'm not trying to scold anyone at all or anything like that. But how often does God bless us and we sit back like a bratty child and ruin the good day that God made? Is that God's fault or is that our fault? Solomon is saying it's not. God made man upright. God hath made a beautiful day. But we've sought out many inventions. We're the ones who keep ruining it. And so Solomon's conclusion so far is that we keep messing everything up. It's a very depressing conclusion to come to. I need to have the quotes. But one writer who just passed away, he made the observation that I think it was George Orwell. I think it was him. When he was a young man, he had made the statement something along the lines that with science, we can drive out religion. We don't need it. And the future is looking very optimistic. And by the time World War II ended, he said humanity is going to destroy itself. He went from being one of the most humanistically optimistic people, in not a bad way. I mean, you got to admire his optimism, to all in the opposite conclusion that, man, we're going to destroy ourselves. There's no hope. And so it's almost like what Solomon is saying. There's no hope. I've sought out wisdom, but I can only go so far. I've sought out relationships, but they're all terrible. This is why I mentioned a couple weeks ago that the book of Ecclesiastes by itself would lead someone to nihilism. There's no point. Everything is so wrong. Everything is so wicked. Everything is hopeless. There's just no point. Now, let me give just three encouragements that are practical, because I don't want to leave us in a negative way. That's never a healthy thing for a Sunday, right? I've learned that the hard way, okay? Number one, wisdom, going back to verse 23 and 24. Number one, wisdom should lead us to God and help others, not be a pursuit in and of itself. I find, and I've touched on this so much, I'll try not to linger, but I find that there are some things in life that are not to be the end, they're to be the means to the end. And when we turn them into the end and not the means to the end, we find they don't actually bring us as much happiness as we thought it would. One thing I really appreciate, I've not listened to him for years, so if he's gone off the deep end or gone nuts, then forgive me for it. But one thing I've always appreciated about Dave Ramsey, the financial guy, is that he always mentions that the purpose of having wealth is really to help others. And he says that you should get your finances in order. I'm summarizing terribly. Get your finances in order. That way, in the end, you can help those. And I appreciate that, because my generation had this idea that if I had the money, then I would help others, and we ought to, but we don't have the money. But interestingly enough, I've met a lot of people who get the money and then they become very, very stingy, and all of a sudden the money they longed for so long doesn't make them happy. Why? Because that's not the end. It's supposed to be a means to an end. The pursuit of wisdom, and I use the word wisdom extremely broadly. I use it biblically, theologically, Christianly. I use it even in the things of this world, the things that we can enjoy in this world. The pursuit of wisdom should not be the end of itself. It should be the means to an end. If I decide I want to become the best mechanic in the world, and I read and watch and practice everything with the best mechanic in all of Paris, but then I never work on a car. I get all of the training, and then Lauren asks me to change the oil. I say, nope, I'm not going to do it. Then what's the point? I know a lot of Christians, and they're wise and pursue wisdom. That's good. But it needs to be practical. What's the point in knowing about God's love if we don't become loving? What's the point in knowing about God's grace if we're not gracious? Part of Solomon's problem, I believe, in verse 23 and 24 was that he thought wisdom was the end goal, when wisdom is always a means to an end. A means to an end. Wisdom should lead us to God, and it should cause us to help others, which is what our Savior said is the greatest of all commandments, to love the Lord thy God and to love your neighbor as yourself. Wisdom should make us love God and love others. That's why, and this is a nuanced topic, but have you ever met Christians who their shirt is so stiff they can't move their neck? They're brilliant theologians, but they have no love for anyone else. That doesn't sit well with me. They may be smarter than me, but if they can't love me, I'm not that interested. You know what I'm saying? Wisdom ought to cause us to love God and to love others. And if we're not loving God and loving others, then what's the point in pursuing wisdom? Number 2, in light of his observation in verses 25 through 28, actually, we need to strive to be good examples to come to those who come after us. As young parents, and I'm so glad I'm not alone today. No, I was kidding. As young parents, we need to raise good men and virtuous women. We can see, I know they reference, is it the 50s or 60s as a sexual revolution? Not even a whole century yet, and look how corrupt our society has become. And it is a very, very dark and disgusting world out there. And it's our responsibility to leave good examples as parents, but as I kind of mentioned Sunday school this morning to the men, just to those who are behind us. As I've mentioned before, your influence on my daughter probably won't be as strong as mine, but there is an influence. My influence on Lyle and Henry will not be strong as their parents, but there is an influence. And it's our responsibility to raise good men and virtuous women. Number 3 and number 4 kind of go hand in hand. 1A of this last point is this. Solomon's conclusion at the end of verse 29 is extremely bleak. But it's bleak because it ought to lead us to the cross. What I mean by that, God hath made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions. How do you fix that? If humanity keeps seeking out many inventions, what do? Tie them down more? Cut their hands off? Lobotomize their imagination? No, you change the heart. And that is exactly what God did through the gospel of Jesus Christ. He changed the heart. What's my point? Yeah, the world is wicked, but there is hope in the person and work of Jesus Christ. I believe the whole purpose of Ecclesiastes, as bleak as it can be, is to serve as a contrast to the gospel. And secondly to that, be ready to show people how beautiful and glorious, and may I even say superior, not in an arrogant way, Christianity is. I've been challenged by a preacher. I've alluded to it many times already, but it wasn't really sermons or lectures, but one thing he did, he took different aspects of life, and he said, now, there's there's the modern view, the modern philosophy on some of these thoughts, but here, what I want to do is show you how the Bible has a better answer. One thing, and then the biggest example of this is the resurrection. And I was chasing a rabbit with my brother-in-law about the resurrection the other night, but do you understand how how much hope the resurrection gives us? The hope of the resurrection is more powerful than the hope of whatever Muslims believe. The hope of the resurrection is it's infinitely better than merely being reincarnated as a stink bug or as a caterpillar, as a butterfly. The hope of the resurrection means that we're still physical creatures, that we get to live all of eternity with our loved ones. So what the resurrection gives me is infinitely superior. It is infinitely better than anything this world has to offer. This preacher, he went down through the line of a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, identity, and I'm not going to get into all of that, of course, but what I want us to see is that Solomon comes to the conclusion it is all vanity and vexation of spirit, but through the Son of God who came in the form of a man, we have a hope and comfort that far exceeds anything and everything this world has to offer. So may we find our hope and our comfort in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let's all stand.